Welcome to another Western Ag Life Voices podcast, where we celebrate the people that make up the rich fabric of the Western lifestyle. Please do us a favor and thank the sponsors, because without them, we couldn't bring you these free podcasts.
Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Paul Ramirez with the Western Ag Life podcast, and we got a great guest on this morning. I have Mr. Randall Reeder. And Randall is all things Will Rogers. And one thing that I'm excited about and would look forward to doing this for quite some time. I've been a follower of Randall on the social media for quite some time. I'm a huge Will Rogers fan and have been almost all my life. And I think I read every book, and I have every book that Will Rogers certainly was ever written about him or wrote himself. And I'm just a huge Will Rogers fan, and I think when Randall and I get into, Randall is probably the foremost expert in the United States on all things Will Rogers, and he's got a book coming out. We're going to talk about that, and then just all the essence that he has done throughout the United States, in talking about Will Rogers and basically, being who Will Rogers was. And so, Randall, good morning to you. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Paul, and I try to live up to that fantastic introduction.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if I ever was anybody I would want to emulate, it certainly would be Will Rogers. You picked a great subject to start, and so before we get into it, I just kind of want to find out a little bit about you and kind of what the lead up was to you, becoming, your relationship or your affinity for Will Rogers. Where'd you grow up as a young child?
Well, I grew up in West Virginia, a small farm. We had cattle, certainly not a ranch like Will Rogers grew up in Indian Territory, what's now Oklahoma, but we had cattle. So I've got the agricultural background, graduated from West Virginia University. I'm an agricultural engineer, which keeps me grounded. And then I spent 33 years on the faculty at Ohio State University as an extension agriculture engineer, again, working mainly with farmers in Ohio and across the Midwest on corn and soybean production and machinery issues related to that.
And so were you a teacher? You were in lecture teacher, or you worked mainly in the extension area?
Well, I was mainly in extension. For a while I taught a machinery management class, but mainly extension, and working, giving talks, writing what we call fact sheets, basic information in easy to understand language, translating research into, and doing research. I did research on no-till and other tillage systems as we're trying to move from plowing to what we call no-tillage, and doing more of that. And also a really exciting topic of soil compaction. In agriculture, we try to eliminate compaction.
Sure.
When you're building a road, civil engineers try to add compaction, but we try to eliminate it.
I'm sure we could have you come on the podcast, and we could do a whole segment on tillage and soil
Yes, sir.
and preps for our farmers that listen to the podcast. So did you spend your whole career at Ohio State?
Almost all of it. I had 10 years prior to that. In fact, I spent a year and a half at the University of Arizona, straight out of graduate school. I was a research associate there working on cotton.
And so what years would have those been, Randall?
1969 and 70.
Oh, well, I was born in 64, so you were here when I was troopsing around. So, yeah. Well, a lot of things, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if you've been back recently, but a lot of things, Tucson is a different town for sure.
I was there 2 years ago and was on campus and drove by the house that we rented for a year and a half. So things have changed in Tucson, just like they've changed where I am now here in the
everywhere,
Ohio area.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Tucson is a change town from then, for sure. And so I guess we're kind of at that point in time, where you start. So how old were you when you first became aware of Will Rogers?
I was at, this was in 1996. I was at the National Speakers Association convention in Orlando, and a prominent speaker from Oklahoma, Dale Minnick, saw me as he walked toward me. First thing he said to me was, "You got to be Will Rogers."
Huh.
And I didn't even have a hairdo like my haircut like this either, but I looked like Will. So he just kept on me. He said, God put you on earth to do this. So man, when somebody from Oklahoma says you got to be Will Rogers, well, you pay attention. So that's
Sure.
how I started speaking, a little bit of speaking, and I'm glad there's no recordings of those early talks. But and then writing a weekly column. I started that in like September 97, and I've been doing that ever since.
And so, but I guess my curiosity. So you were aware of who Will Rogers was, right? Prior
Yeah,
to
I was
that
aware of it.
being,
I wasn't a fan, and I had never even thought about the fact that I might look a little bit like Will at that time.
isn't that amazing? It's kind of what that's kind of what they call what's serendipity. That something like that would kind of happen. And lo and behold, those kind of things are meant to happen. They're not accidents. Those are things that should happen. And yeah, I think probably our society is thankful that transpired, because at least for me, I've been a Will Rogers fan since I was a teenager. And I remember looking up some of his quotes, and then of course I would quote him frequently, in term papers and stuff like that when I was in high school. So I've been a big time Will. And then as soon as I became an adult where I could do my own things, one of the first vacations we ever made was to go to Oklahoma and visit Homestead. And of course, we went to the museum, and uh, yeah, just amazed, always been a Will Rogers fan. And I guess one of the reasons that I've always been a Will Rogers fan is that I also like to rope. And
Oh yeah,
I roped, in amateur rodeos and that for some time. And so I've always just, I remember, watching old rope tricks of Will Rogers. And that's probably where I developed my real affinity for him, was, watching, he had there's a little short movie out called The Roping Fool.
the rope and fool. Yep.
Yeah. And so that when that first came out, back then that was VHS days, right? And I literally wore that VHS tape out watching that. And I could I could play almost every particular scene in that, tape out, even,
Yeah.
when he, remember he wakes up at night and ropes a mouse.
Yes. Oh yes. With a
I
string,
just, yeah,
string
with a
lasso.
string, and
Yeah.
yeah, roping was always on his mind. And so and then then my curiosity then certainly progressed into starting to read and consume as much material about him as I possibly can. And I have some older books. Hopefully someday you come back to Tucson, I'll share my library with you, that I have of some really old copies of some of his books. And so yeah, that's he was a
That's
fantastic
fantastic.
individual and had a great story. The story still today is, I mean, it's just amazing, from where he came, to ended up, the basically, he had his role in society, was one like, I don't know, has there ever been anybody that's kind of duplicated his role in society?
I've read this interestingly, a book named about 6 or 8 different people that it would take to replace one Will Rogers in current things. Just think about, he was a newscaster, so just think of somebody on the network news in every evening. Of course, a movie star. So just pick out your top movie star, top earner, most popular in Hollywood. Think of a newspaper columnist, somebody writing an opinion column. Think of op-ed in a Sunday paper. And then there's nobody that does this. Will was writing a daily item. It might be a couple of paragraphs, sometimes a little bit longer, but a short one. And that would be on the front page of newspapers across the country, probably 500 newspapers at one time. So that was one of the first things that people would read when they got their newspaper the next day. So that was always topical. It was what we're talking about. Anyway, that gives you an idea of the breadth of what Will Rogers covered. He was on radio, started out in vaudeville, but got on radio, made silent movies, and then he was mediocre as a silent movie star. But when the movie started talking, his first talkie was in 1929, and then he made 21 movies altogether. Of course, those were black and white. They already had a little bit of color photography, but there's no color photos of Will Rogers. There's no color movies of Will Rogers.
Are there any color photos of Will Rogers? I don't ever remember seeing a color photo of Will Rogers.
You've seen them, but they've been colorized.
Okay, so there wouldn't have been any of that. Yeah, and then his just some of the stories of him leaving his place there in Oklahoma and traveling to the world, basically performing his roping sticks
in school. He didn't like school. And he finally quit when he was about 18 years old. And the general consensus is he probably had about a 10th grade education. But then I think he was 23 when he loved geography, and he had read about the gauchos in Argentina, at that time called the Argentine. So he had some cattle and he's sold his cattle. His dad bought his cattle so he'd have money to travel, even though his dad objected to the idea. But Will wanted to go to the Argentine. So one of his friends went with him, and Will promised his friend that he would make sure he had enough money to get back home. Well, they got to the Argentine, and the short version of it is once they got into where the cattle country was, they found out that was not a good life at all, that you had to have a lot of money to invest to get into the cattle business. And those gauchos that Will was so fascinated by didn't make any money. So he ended up being broke. His friend went back to Oklahoma, Indian Territory at the time. And instead of going home himself, even though he was broke, Will got a job on a ship going to South Africa, loaded with cattle and mules, and spent about 25 days on that ship. And Will got seasick, so
I bet.
Big problem for him. But that was remarkable because in South Africa, he ended up getting in touch with a Wild West show, Texas Jack's Wild West show. And Will credits him, Texas Jack, who was actually from Texas, that he learned the business. He learned show business from Texas Jack. And one of the things he learned, I bet you do this too, Paul, he said, when you're on stage, you learn when to get off. You quit while you're still at a peak, and you don't continue on after the audience is tired of listening to you. So that ended up being remarkable. And then instead of coming home from South Africa, he ended up working on another ship going to New Zealand and Australia. And he got a letter of recommendation, worked for the Worth Brothers Circus in Australia. That was in generally the southeast corner of Australia, and was there for a while. earned enough money to get on a ship coming to San Francisco. Got conned into a poker game, lost all his money. So he had to work about 6 or 8 more months to get enough money, as he said, to come home. And instead of first class, he was bottom class on the sailing ship. But he finally got back home. That was almost 2.5 years he was away. So think of it this way. He had an around the world journey before he was 25 years old.
Oh my goodness. And so certainly when he came back to Oklahoma after all of those situation, but he didn't stay in Oklahoma very long after that then.
In fact, as soon as he got home, the St. Louis World Fair was going on, and he was already, well, of course, he was a fantastic roper, world class. So he connected with one of the outfits that he knew already in Oklahoma, and got a chance to perform at the World's Fair in St. Louis. And the interesting story there, if you want me to tell it, that while he was with the Worth brothers in Australia, the wife of Mr. Worth, and Will was known as the Cherokee Kid on that show, and she made him a bright red satin, velvet, not satin, velvet tight-fitting outfit with gold braids on it, all kind of fancy. And that's what Will performed in with the Worth Brothers Circus. Well, when he got back home, he had a chance to do his rope tricks at the World's Fair. And by chance, a young lady who he had met and actually was already in love with, Betty Blake, was there in St. Louis, and they got connected, and he thought, man, I am going to impress her tonight, and I'm going to wear that red velvet outfit. So he came out on his pony and started doing his rope tricks, and Betty was sitting there with her sister and a cousin, just looking forward to seeing her great friend, Will Rogers. And he came out wearing a gaudy velvet outfit, and she was just horrified and embarrassed. So, but anyway, she told Will she didn't like it. Will never wore that outfit again. He probably tossed it in the trash. And of course, the good news is I think it was 4 years later we got married.
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, wasn't there a tie to her from a cousin or something that he had kind of started a relationship with first?
She was from a town called, remarkably enough, Rogers, Arkansas.
Yes.
Northwest corner of Arkansas.
Yes.
She had an illness, and to help her recover, she ended up going to Oologah because her sister or brother-in-law, anyway, the family connection,
Yes,
managed the train station at Oologah. They're in Indian Territory. That's Will Rogers' home area. The ranch was just a couple of miles away from downtown Oologah. So that's where they met. And I think pretty much as soon as Will saw her, he probably saw something he liked there. But it took 8 years before they got married.
Isn't that something? Yeah, and all his world travels in that. It's amazing. The story is amazing in itself. Now, is there still the Will Rogers Museum there in Oklahoma?
Yeah, it's a great museum. It's at Claremore.
Claremore, yeah.
Right on just off Route 66.
And then
historic Route 66.
Yeah,
that's fantastic place.
It is all kinds of, and then of course for me, it was one of the highlights definitely of my life to go out to the ranch and see, his homestead, where he grew up and stuff like that, and just to walk in that, sage country and just beautiful country. And so, yeah, what a life he lived. And so then, so he gets married, and then at that point in time, things for him continue to, he becomes more and more popular.
Right. He was already doing the vaudeville shows, and he, in fact, he and Betty wrote that they were planning to settle down and and have a ranch there in Oklahoma. But a couple of things happened with Will, and these, as you would know this, Paul, that sometimes you call it serendipity or whatever, but he was performing in New York City, Madison Square Garden. Now, it's not the same Madison Square Garden as we have today, but doing rope tricks, and a steer got loose out of the arena and jumped into the crowd, up into the crowd. And you've seen, well, anyway, so Will got his lasso and went up in there and lassoed that steer, and probably with some help got it back down into the arena. Well, that made front page newspapers the next day. And so he became quite well, anytime you're on the front page of a newspaper in a good way,
especially in New York City.
In New York City. So that was one example that helped him become a star and move on. Of course, he was so talented. Now, I'll say it this way: in vaudeville days, and for those young people who may not know much about vaudeville, those were live shows, and typically there might be 10 different acts during a performance, and each one would have about 10 minutes. Will's act was what was called then a dumb act, just meaning he did not talk. Just think of others where they would not be doing any talk, like a magician. So he was doing his rope tricks for 8 or 10 minutes. And of course, he was a fantastic star. But he really became a star when his wife Betty and Florence Ziegfeld, with the famous Ziegfeld Follies, said, "Will, why don't you just start explaining what you're doing with these rope tricks, or talk a little bit?" And when he started talking, he was always funny, and that just really accelerated his career when he was talking.
Yeah, so I can imagine, he probably started with some little one-liners, which he was notorious for, little, I don't know what we call now zingers or whatever, just, and of course he had the delivery was from a dry sense of humor, correct?
Oh, yes. Well, think of it this way. Today, we might call these savor lines. In other words, if a joke doesn't go over well, then, well, you add another line or two to it and hope you get a laugh from that. In Will's case, rope tricks. Now, he was so good, he very seldom missed. Mm-hmm. But think about it this way, Paul. He actually typed out about 10 savor lines that he could use when a trick didn't work. And they always got laughs. For example, if he had a horse and rider riding across the stage, and Will would toss his lasso and catch all 4 legs of the horse. So now if he missed and only caught 3 legs, then his savor line, ad-libbed, or supposedly ad-libbed, would be, "Well, I got all of these legs in there except one." and that would get a good laugh from the crowd. And he had 10 of those. And every comedian or humor speaker today has these prepared ad-lib lines that they use. And that started more than 100 years ago.
Yeah. And the irony, because I've heard this about other comedians, for sure, Robin Williams was one of those people that, said that basically he was very shy. He was a reserved person. However, when he provided an environment for him to, shine, that's when he really, and it seemed to me like in just my study of Will Rogers that Will wasn't like a real gregarious person per se by nature. But when he had the opportunity, it seemed that he seemed to shine on stage more than he probably would, in just a conventional situation. Yes, no?
I think there's some truth to that. Of course, he was totally authentic. He was the same person on
Yes.
stage as he was in real life. But he was known among his friends for telling stories or doing rope tricks or roping them when they least expected it. And he always had a rope in his hands, and that got him in trouble in school.
And so
Over and
what you're
over.
saying, so what you're saying then basically is he did have a star component or a performing component to it, probably most of his life.
I think so. And he never sat still.
Mm-hmm.
Different people have commented on that in books I've read about him, that he was fidgety. He was frequently talking. He just he just had to be doing something active, even when he was sitting around the house at home. After they built the house at Pacific Palisades in California, if he was sitting around, he'd be roping a stuffed calf that he had there at the house, or doing rope tricks, or doing something. He just couldn't sit still.
Well, and going back to maybe that's one of the reasons, I guess he excessively used to like to chew gum, correct? He was a gum
Oh
chewer.
yeah, he was famous as a gum chewer.
Yeah. I see some of the old vaudeville deals and, little skits that he would do. And you could always tell he was kind of always chomping on gum.
When he did probably the best known radio program he did, and that was a special program during the Great Depression with President Herbert Hoover. And Will's segment was about 15 minutes long, but you could, and of course it was radio, but I'm sure you've seen the film of it too, that you could see he was very visibly chewing gum. But if you just listened to it, you would never notice it. So his gum chewing did not interfere at all with his talking.
And he used to make little quirks about his gum chewing too, didn't he?
He had another one of these lines that when he missed doing a rope trick, he took the gum out, stuck it on the side of the stage,
Oh,
and then did the rope trick again. Of course, it worked. So
it was the gum.
then he went back and retrieved the gum and put it back in his mouth. So the audience perception was, yeah, that gum chewing got in his way of doing the rope trick. But so he made a lot of that. When Calvin Coolidge was president, and he decided just before the 1928 election that he was not going to run for re-election. So Calvin Coolidge's phrase was, I choose not to run. I choose not to run. Well, Will Rogers changed that to CHEWS. So he said, I choose to run. He had a fun time as just pretending to run for president. And that was in articles in Life magazine. It's a different Life magazine that we had most recently, but it was Life magazine. And several columns appeared in that where he did pretend to run on the bunkless political party.
Mm-hmm.
And his main theme was, if elected, I'll immediately resign.
I remember one of the quotes that he had is that, he's talking about in Washington. He says, they've gotten elected over there and there was some gridlock. They're not getting anything done. And that's the best for all of us in America, for them not to get anything done.
Best news. Yeah. Congress deadlocked. Yeah.
So, I guess at that particular time, it must have been, how do I want to say, I wouldn't say risky, but certainly, up until that point in time, I think from a historical standpoint, there hadn't been really, my recollection. Of course, I'm not a political historian or anything, but there hadn't been anybody that would kind of make satire of politics and certainly talk about a president, from that kind of satire, take on it. Was Will like one of the first people to kind of do that?
Yeah, right. Mark Twain did a little bit of it.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
put in the context here, I don't think we pointed out that Will was born in 1879. And the round the world trip we mentioned was like 1902. And then he died in 1935. So he was most popular from roughly 1915 until he died 20 years later. And in terms of the satire, he never criticized a person based on their looks. He never talked about somebody with a bald head. He never told mother-in-law jokes. And in terms of politics, he just joked about or commented on the issues. He would joke or criticize somebody because they favored one side or the other in terms of some issue. And he had a remarkable way. He could criticize a president or a congressman or a senator, and in the same paragraph, he would say something funny at the end that even though he had said something critical about Senator so-and-so, that it would make that person laugh or smile at the end of Will's comment. And everybody liked him. Everybody in Congress liked him. He had more, if you just took out of context some of the things that he wrote and said about Congress and presidents, you'd think, oh my golly, he's such a horrible person. But when you put it in context with the full information, it just comes out as funny. And you're right, he was known for satire, and everybody liked him for it.
Well, I think the essence of the deal, I think for him though, is that I think most people at that particular time knew that it wasn't nefarious what he was trying to do, and it wasn't mean spirited. You know what I mean?
It was in fun.
He was poking fun.
Yeah,
and somehow or another, we've come a long ways from there. You know what I mean? Today, everything is so serious, and we've lost this whole deal. And like you said, he didn't make fun of your mother-in-law, or if you didn't have hair or whatever, but he would poke fun at people, but in a good spirit, I guess, in a spirit that was not malicious or vindictive, and then he'd figure out the way to make it lighthearted at the end, where, like you said, even if they were the brunt of what his statement was, it wasn't mean-spirited.
Absolutely. And he could always end up at the end with something funny or something complimentary of a person. If he was criticizing a president for some issue that Will didn't agree on, then by the end he would praise that person for something else.
And he would, be able to, candor up enough respect from the individual, that they would actually want to have dialogue with him, and meet him and talk with him. And, I just think today, if you think about where we are, and, I don't like to talk too much about politics on this forum, but
we're talking about Will Rogers. So Will Rogers did a lot of political commentary, and it was both sides. As you well know,
he was a Democrat, right?
I'm not a member of any organized political party. I'm a Democrat.
Yeah, I'm a Democrat. But I just, man, wouldn't it be nice to have somebody surface today in our society that could, kind of gather the troops up here, both sides? It's just the line is so deep and, wide that people just, you're either one way or the other, and just no tolerance for, gosh, it just seems like life has become so serious. And I really don't think our maker designed us to have this seriousness going on. Doesn't seem to be good for society. Yay, nay, what you say?
I'm here. I'm trying to keep
the
legend alive. But you're right. It'd be so good to have somebody, and we can talk about the late night humor guys on TV that going back to Johnny Carson, and I watched a lot of Johnny Carson, and then even Jay Leno after that. And I think I'm correct in saying this. You couldn't tell anything political about Johnny Carson.
No,
that he would joke about all sides.
Mm-hmm.
And today it seemed like most of them are one-sided. They're one side
Mm-hmm.
or the other.
Yeah,
And
it's
they
like you
just,
can't. Yeah, it's like, and that's a good analogy about Jay Leno. I think Jay did a really good job, and especially in these modern times of, kind of staying out of the weeds per se. But now, I mean, and so it makes you not even want to watch that, program because I mean, it seems mean spirited, just really mean spirited. I mean,
and that's just one example. We have split the country. In other words, half of the people don't watch those shows, and the other half watch a different show.
yeah,
So
it's kind of like
instead of
you go to what you kind of draw to, and I don't know, it seems like we certainly could bring some. It'd be nice if we could bring some lightheartedness back into this society. I don't know that happens anytime soon, but hopefully, we certainly, America could use some, I guess, some enlightenment for a better lack of a better term. So yeah, I mean, just yeah. Anyways, we probably should move on from that before I'm going to get in trouble here pretty soon. But anyways,
well,
yeah,
I could. Let me give you a couple of things here that this is one. And when I'm giving my talks, I usually spend at least 5 minutes on politics, both sides, because there are so many things I could do. But let me just use this one that. Compared to Congress, the thing about my jokes is they don't hurt anybody. You can say they're funny or they're horrible or they're good or whatever, but they don't do any harm. But with Congress, every time they make a joke, it's a law. And every time they make a law, it's a joke.
yeah, or it's not funny.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I love the one he used to say. Our Constitution protects aliens, drunks, and U.S. senators.
Right. Yep. And he
And
also
that,
said there's no other requirement to get elected to the Senate except being 35 years old.
yeah,
That's the only requirement.
and geez, and so yeah, what a and then let's go ahead and segue into a little bit then, because he did start. At some point in time, he must have loaded up the family and moved to Hollywood. And, because then he must have been more and more active in the filmmaking, more requirements for
Well,
him, right?
let me tell you briefly how that happened. He was a star on vaudeville with the Ziegfeld Follies. And think of the Ziegfeld Follies as being the Cadillac of all the vaudeville shows. A fellow there this was 1918. Young guy was starting to make silent movies named Samuel Goldfish. And he talked Will into making a movie. Well, the movies at that time were right there in New Jersey. Thomas Edison invented so many things related to it. He invented a movie camera, for example. So right across the Hudson River from New York City, where Will was performing. So he made a silent movie there, and then Samuel Goldfish decided, California would be a much better place to make movies than New Jersey. So the movies moved to California, Los Angeles area, and Samuel Goldfish said, I think I'll change my name to Goldwyn, Goldwyn. And everybody recognizes that today as Metro Goldwyn Mayer movies. And that was when Will, anyway, that was the start of movies. And Will made about 3 times as much money. So that's why he went into the movies and left New York City at that time. Now, he still did a little bit with Ziegfeld Follies later on, but that got him into Hollywood, into Beverly Hills. He ended up being elected the honorary mayor of Beverly Hills. And later, right after that, the California legislature passed a law that a city had to be a certain size to have a mayor. So Beverly Hills was a 6th class town at that time. And so Will lost his mayor position. He said, if I'd known we were only a 6th class city, I never would have accepted it. Anyway, so he got to Beverly Hills, and somewhere about 1925, he had bought 300 and some acres in Pacific Palisades, and he also bought 3/4 of a mile stretch of beach, and it's almost within sight. The ranch that he bought, the 300 acres, is probably about 3 miles, and there, hey, great. There's the barn that he had moved there. It wasn't built from scratch. It was actually taken down in pieces and moved, and had about 25 stalls. And Will also had constructed a polo field. So you can tell this is sloping land. This is not flat land. And he had leveled out an area, so the polo field, and that polo field is still there. And I think they play during the season anyway. Maybe every Sunday afternoon they have polo matches. So that's a little bit of the background of how he got to Hollywood and eventually bought that land. Another well-known quote, and I paraphrase it a little bit: buy land because you aren't making any more of it.
Amen. You hear that quoted quite frequently in the real estate business today still.
Absolutely. And that to bring that to today, the 3/4 mile beach is now the Will Rogers State Beach, and the 300 acres was thinned down. It's about 186 acres. That is the Will Rogers State Historic Park.
Yes. And certainly, the devastation, I think so many of our listeners are aware of, the California fires. And this is something I didn't have good knowledge about until, meeting you, was, the state park situation that, the Rogers family foundation, whatever, had. And I guess it's a state park. Is that correct?
Will died in 1935. Betty lived until 9 more years, and she donated the beach and the ranch, including the house, to the state of California to serve as a park. And the stipulation was that the state would maintain the house and the barn and everything else there on that land. And a beautiful location. January 6th or 7th, right at the beginning of the well-known fires that hit Los Angeles, hit Pacific Palisades first, and the Santa Ana winds just like 75 miles an hour blew in and burned the house, burned that barn that you showed the picture of. Here's the house as it is today, 2 chimneys standing, and that's all that's left of the house. And that's just a tragedy that I don't want to get into politics here, but it should have been prevented. There was a plan in place where they can spray a gel on the roof of a house or a building, and it prevents it from catching fire. And they did not do that. There's also in California, remove all brush from anywhere near a building, because it's brush that catches fire and then catches the house on fire. And there was still a lot of brush on the hillside behind the house and right around the house. But what we're calling brush could just be bushes. In other words, anything more than grass. Green grass is fine, but that was not done either. So the house burned. There were 17 horses in the barn, but folks got all the horses out, and with about an hour to spare. Wow, it was tight. The volunteers and staff people got 4 pickup truckloads of artifacts, artwork, and some other things out of the house. But there were so many things that they could not get out, so that was all lost.
Yeah, what what a shame, what a shame. And so I guess they're, probably it's probably too new to have some kind of a plan to, re I guess reclaim or redo. You know what I mean? What's the likelihood that that place will ever be put back to what it was?
I don't think it ever will be. I need to mention Will's great granddaughter, Jennifer Rogers Echeverry, who recently moved to Claremore, Oklahoma. And she spent most of her life in Bakersfield, California. Well, she's the official Will Rogers family representative to the state park. And she spent some time there. I don't know if you've got a picture of her with looking or walking around the burned out house. But anyway, she recently met with the state park officials, and I don't know what the result of that is. There's some are optimistic that there'll be something rebuilt there. My feeling, partly as an engineer and being a realist, they will never rebuild the house the way it was.
No.
They might probably be some kind of a visitor center there and maybe a few things of Will Rogers, but it will never be the same. Don't know if they'll ever rebuild the horse barn or not.
No, I bet you not.
Yeah, probably not. But I'm sure it'll remain a state park because it's just so popular by the people there in Pacific Palisades and around Los Angeles. While we're talking about the burned house, let me throw in something else too. Among the staff members and the volunteers, the docents who volunteered their time at the park, 8 of those volunteers and 1 staff member lost their own houses in Pacific Palisades.
Wow.
That's just another tragic part of it. Here they were trying to save things from the Will Rogers house, and they lost their own.
Just, I mean, especially when you look at aerials of that, it almost looks up, it just is devastating, it almost looks apocalyptic, to, I mean, it's just, I don't even understand how that's possible anymore, that we could have that kind of devastation, but.
Well, again, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but the plans that they had were not carried out. And that's what led.
Or scarier than that, maybe there were no plans.
Well, there was a plan for the state park.
Yeah. Oh, was there? Yeah. Well, we better stay out of the weeds on that. But anyways, it's I think back about one story, that I remember hearing about Will is that, when he first started making movies, I forget what director he was working for, but part of his contract, there was a stipulation in his contract that every lunch hour that he got several hours and he would leave and go home and rope with his family. And it was part of his contract to go home and rope with the kids.
Well, I didn't know about that, but there were a lot more interesting things with John Ford. Was one of his directors.
Actually, it was with John Ford. So part of his contract was John Ford is that, I don't know, from the noon hour to like 2:00, he could leave every day and he would go home and rope with the kids.
Well, yeah. And here's another interesting thing that when people watching movies today, actors and actresses, they're doing the part. Will Rogers, as part of his contract, was that he was pretty much required to help write the script and rewrite the script. And the movies that he did, he actually played himself in a lot of ways. The Connecticut Yankee movie that based on a Mark Twain book, he did roping in that movie. So he had all kind of things, and of course the scripts that he would change, the funny lines or the lines that he would change to were much funnier and more interesting. So it was actually written into his contract that was expected of him to make those changes, and he would ad lib. Joel McCrea, handsome young man, came to Hollywood and made 2 movies with Will. And the first one, Joe McCrea has expressed it this way, that Will was ad-libbing so much in the script, and Joel McCrea, being a young actor, was accustomed to having a script and a cue.
Uh-huh.
And finally, Will said, all right, we're sitting here together. When I'm done talking, I'll just tap you on the leg and you say something, and then we'll go on that way. So that was the way Will worked with Joel McCrea, and Will really enjoyed that young actor. And of course, Joel McCrea became a star. And here's another interesting thing, that Will, knowing he was handsome, he said, Joel, invest half your money and live off the other half. Don't invest your money in fast cars or beautiful women or vice versa. Invest in land. So Joel McCrea took that serious. He bought 200 acres nearby, and eventually increased that to 2,400 acre ranch. In fact, Joel McCrea described himself as more of a rancher than an actor. But here's the interesting thing about that investment: that most of that land is now part of the city of Thousand Oaks, California.
Oh my goodness!
So quite an investment,
for sure.
And that gives you an idea of what that 186 acre park, that's now the Will Rogers State Park, what that would be worth to sell on the open market.
Yeah,
you would,
for sure.
Paul, you would enjoy auctioneering that sale, I'm sure.
Yes. Yeah, I would enjoy that for sure. So
hey, we have a picture of Jennifer, Roger. We've talked about Jennifer. I don't know if you can flash one of those up on the screen or not.
I don't have one of her, per se in that way. But so we'll come back to Jennifer and your guys' collaboration that you guys have going on. But I want to stay, so Will continued to have a venturous side to him. And he also had a real affinity for airplanes. He liked flying, and, he liked, and he liked pilots. And, but, and we're rounding up now his life and coming to the end there, this adventurous side that he had, in the exploration of Alaska and so forth, ended up being his demise, And so tell me a little bit about what you knew or what you've studied, about what happened, that basically came to the end of his life.
Well, he had a great affinity for airplanes, and including with General Billy Mitchell, who got court-martialed in 1925 because General Mitchell, felt that airplanes might have an important role in future wars. And Army and Navy brass had him court-martialed for that. And Will is one of the few people inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame who was not a pilot or manufacturer of airplanes. He was just a proponent, and actually got permission from the Department of Commerce to fly on mail planes before there were scheduled passenger flights. He would just pay by the pound. He joked he just put on enough stamps to cover my cost. But then he was in at least 6 different crashes or accidents or incidents in airplanes. Of course, those would have been on landing, and a lot of that was grass or mud landing strips. One of them, the plane turned upside down. He was never seriously injured, but here's something nobody else can ever claim, that he was in 2 crashes on one trip. And but moving on to the end, Wiley Post was a fantastic pilot.
And they were good friends, right?
And they were good friends because he was a pilot. Wiley Post lived in Oklahoma. One eye, he lost an eye in an oil field accident. So think of a world-class pilot who could only see out of one eye.
Yeah, my goodness.
Wiley had the idea of the shortest route from the United States to Russia was over the North Pole. Forget about going around the Atlantic Ocean. And so he was going to try that as a business venture, and Will learned about it. He said, well, I've never been to Alaska. So he helped finance that trip. And the bottom line was that they were in Alaska. Weather was not good, but Wiley was getting antsy. They'd already been weather delayed, and they took off and landed on an inlet at Point Bear, Alaska, one of the northernmost points in Alaska. Landed there to ask directions because they weren't quite to Point Barrow. And they were able to get, even though the language was not the same from an Inuit, but got directions to go that way to Point Barrow. On taking off, maybe 50 feet or 100 feet in the air, the engine died, and the plane just crashed nose first straight into the water. Water about near the shore, so it was 3 or 4 feet deep. And if you've seen pictures of parts of the plane still sticking up, but Will and Wiley were both killed instantly. That was August the 15th, 1935.
Wow. Yep. Well, we missed a lot, huh? Because who knows what he would have accomplished or got done, how old was he when he passed?
55. And I've
55.
thought different times, if he'd lived another 20 years, just think about it. If he had from 1935 to 1955,
he'd have went through the Depression. Yeah.
We ended the Depression, World War II, recovery in Europe, the Marshall Plan, and getting business recovery under Eisenhower here. Now, Will had plans. He owned 20 acres there in Claremore, Oklahoma, up on a hill overlooking the city. And he was planning to retire there with Betty. Well, that 20 acres is now where the Will Rogers Museum is.
Okay. That's a beautiful museum. Yeah, if you have never gotten the opportunity, I highly recommend that you go there. And it's, the memorabilia there, and it's just, it's a very tasteful. Yeah, it's a nice place. Really, really nice.
I get there at least once a year. There's a big celebration for Will's birthday on November the 4th. So it's the weekend, usually the weekend before November the 4th. And that's always a big occasion.
And then go, for sure, go out to the homestead.
Oh, absolutely. At Oologah, the birthplace ranch, the Cherokee Nation has now taken over the operation of that. The house, the original house, was moved up to a higher location because they built a dam on the Verdigris River, and the foundation is now underwater. So the house is about half a mile,
not in the original location,
still there. It's beautiful facility, beautiful house, beautiful barn. So a tremendous place to visit also.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's great. Listen, so we're just about going to kind of wrap it up. I'm sure you and I could come on and we will probably come on maybe another time and we'll talk, maybe we'll take 3 or 4 subjects and kind of really get into it. But I know you guys are working on a book with Will Rogers' granddaughter. Is that correct?
Great-granddaughter.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that. When's that coming out? What is that? What are you guys doing there?
The title of the book is Common Horse Sense from Will Rogers. And the subtitle is 7 Timeless Tips for Leaders and Everybody Else. So it's focusing on Will as a servant leader. He never had a title. He was never, discount the honorary mayor of Beverly Hills. He never had more than maybe 4 employees altogether. Now, he did have several horses, but they probably didn't pay attention to him either. But he was what would be referred to as a servant leader. He just provided so many opportunities. And we're doing 2 versions of the book. I mentioned 7 tips, so 7 chapters. But then we're going to do a longer version that will be hardcover and hope to have it out by October. The first one is going to be a smaller book, almost pocket size, and 7 chapters there, including one. I'll just mention 2 of them briefly. Will was a thought leader and an influencer. Now, we know those terms today, but nobody invented thought leader. But he did so many things creatively. That was the first. He used slow motion movie camera when he made The Rope and Fool, because he knew that if it was just regular speed, that people would think it was some kind of a trick. But doing slow motion, you could actually see all the movement of the lasso as it when he threw 3 lassos at one time on a horse and rider, and lassoed 3 different parts. Anyway, so being a thought leader, and he was definitely an influencer. He didn't have TikTok or any other social media, but he influenced leaders. He influenced politicians, everybody. He was a great influence on President Roosevelt. Then another chapter, leaders as comforters. Will Rogers was a comforter. He donated his time. He donated money. He did spatial shows and tours, and we include 3 or 4 of those in the book, including when the Mississippi River flooded in 1927 and obliterated so much land in the state of Mississippi that Will Rogers did a speaking tour to raise money for those sufferers. He did another one in Oklahoma and Texas for drought in the 1930s, raising money for them. He was in Nicaragua 8 days after a major earthquake and just raised money by talking about the Red Cross and how much they needed support. So there's just 3 examples that we include in this book. And it's interesting thinking of Jennifer after that fire burned the house in Pacific Palisades, that Jennifer was getting calls from across the country and actually around the world. And she was amazed that people were still thinking about Will Rogers and had sympathy and empathy for Will. And that's when she realized how much of a comforter he was. Now, my personal note is that Jennifer ended up being on TV in several interviews and posted on Facebook after that fire, that now she has the role of being the comforter in the Will Rogers family, and she's doing a great job of it. Fantastic.
Yeah, fantastic. So when you get the book out and you go to print, why don't you come on with me again, and then we'll get that book out and make sure we'll tell people how they can get the book, and we'll visit back about that.
Fantastic. Sure, I'd love doing
I'm
that.
sure I'll have some other ideas when we come back the second time, because if you can imagine, we've already exhausted an hour, and I could just get going with you. So I appreciate you coming on today. And like I say, I think the really cool thing about it today is that, wouldn't it be nice if somebody would surface, America could acquire another Will Rogers? We need that kind of stability. And like you said, he was a comforter. And so anyways, it's all good. Listen, thank you for coming on. And ladies and gentlemen, tell people, Randall, how they could look at your Facebook or where you at, social media. And you also have a newsletter. Tell me about that real quick.
All right. I'll start with the website. My website is willrogerstoday.com. I'll just mention if willrogers.com is at the Will Rogers Memorial, but for me, it's willrogerstoday.com.
Will
and
Rogers
I write a weekly comments. I've written over 1,200 of them now, and I send those out by email. My email, and people think, oh, geez, why do you still have this email address? But my favorite email address is willrogers@aol.com.
I didn't even know AOL existed anymore till I checked your email.
Yeah.
You've got mail.
I got Will Rogers at AOL.com. So send me an
and
email.
So if they'll send you an email, you'll put them on your list, and you'll start. They'll get access to your weekly.
You'll get my weekly comments. You'll get comments from me, and I always include 2 or 3 quotes from Will Rogers. And there's always, no matter what the news is, Will Rogers had something to say or write that applies to today.
Amen. Yeah, that's for sure. For sure. Yeah. I'll try to put a link on that on the social media out for this too. So,
and then I'm on Facebook also. So I post there. So,
okay.
Again, Facebook is be Will Rogers Today.
And we'll certainly look forward to your book coming out, and we'll bring you, like I say, back on when we come back to that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a good time today here with Randall Reeder. And Randall is, as Will Rogers, and all things Will Rogers. And it's certainly, Randall been one of my favorite podcasts to do. I really look forward to it for a long time. And I can promise you, if you'll promise me, this won't be the only one we'll ever do together. So I look forward to having you back on again. And we'll peel in, we'll peel on a couple, we'll go a little more in depth than we did today. All right.
All right. Great.
Hey, have a great day, and we'll visit back soon. And top of the day, ladies and gentlemen, this is Paul Ramirez rounding up the Western Ag Life. Remember, if it's Western, it's probably us.
Thank you for listening to the Western Ag Life podcast. Tune in again for another great episode. Thank you for listening to the Western Ag